Okay, well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from in the world. My name is Adrian Reed, and I'm really pleased that you could join us for this BA community webinar, which is on a topic which is quite different to some of the topics we've covered recently, and probably a very relevant one for many of us. We're going to be talking about whether it's possible to anticipate the future. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we're living in a world of social distancing where we're perhaps changing our lives in ways that we never anticipated. Perhaps our organizations didn't anticipate a global pandemic. And it's interesting to think about whether we as BAs can be part of thinking about the future, thinking about the strategy, thinking about those events that might need our organizations to take a turn, and thinking about the techniques that we need to deploy to do that. So I'm really, really pleased to say that we're joined by Laurie Silverman, who I'm sure many of you will know, not least because she did a very, very popular session with us earlier. And if you haven't seen that, it's on YouTube. Do go and look it up. But you'll also probably know Laurie from one of the many, many conferences she's spoken at. Laurie, I saw you speak. You did the keynote in South Africa, in Cape Town. You got a standing ovation, a very, very well-deserved standing ovation, I have to say. Author of many, many books, including best-selling books, and I think it's fair to say that you're very, very much into the data side, the foresight, the strategic side, Laurie. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for the invitation.
And I'm really impressed with the amount of sort of preparation you did, Laurie, because I know you actually you sent a message to everyone that commented on the LinkedIn and everyone that expressed an interest in the webinar on social media. You got in touch and essentially said, what do you want to hear? Which means that, like, this is a really agile webinar, because we're going to kind of pivot based on some of the topics that came in. But if you are tuned in live, please do ask your questions too. So I will have the Q&A panel open, and we'll answer as many questions as we can as we go along. So let's start with some of the input you got in advance, Laurie. And one fundamental question that we should probably start with is, can we actually predict the future? Can anyone predict the future? And what does that actually mean for us as BAs?
Well, truthfully, we can't predict the future. I mean, let's just start there. For those of us, and me in particular, I work as a strategist and a futurist. I think that's one of the falsehoods that we encounter. We can anticipate the future, which allows us to prepare for the future, but we can't predict it, because and it doesn't mean that we're still not studying, the year 2030 or 2035 or 2040, but we are looking at multiple kinds of possibilities, which of those might be plausible, which of those might be probable, but where we don't want to go, and this is where people go all the time, is tell me the answer. Yeah. Tell me the one preferred future that's going to happen, because I unfortunately can't do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? So that implies, Laurie, that the actually any sensible analyst or whatever would actually be looking at the multitude of possible futures, and then sort of figuring out which, as you say, are plausible, which are likely. And I suppose to a certain extent, part of the strategizing is about saying, well, okay, if this is the course we're currently on, do we want to nudge that course? Do we want to take that course of least resistance, or do we want to nudge into a slightly different vector?
Well, I think that the challenge that organizations have is that they move to a preferred future. Mm-hmm. And so then they have to do more nudging and more course alterations. If you have an organization, and I think this is a role that BAs can play, that is continually aware of what we call in strategic thinking perking signals, these little signals off to the side that are kind of like out there, but if we're aware of those and we start to track them, because we can, that's part of what competitive intelligence is all about. And if that function's missing in your organization and your strategy group's not doing it, I encourage you you can start it. You can start it as a single BA. You can start it as a COE for BAs. to just start saying what's out there on the fringes that we need to pay attention to, and what are the possible futures that we could hit, because we don't want to choose one. We do not. And that is not what I do with my clients. We approach it quite differently.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've not heard that term before. Did you say perking signals, Laurie?
Yeah, perking signals.
Oh,
yes.
Wow. See, I've heard Dave Snowden talks about weak signals, which sounds like weak signals on the periphery. So a similar sort of thing. So, okay. So sort of moving on to some of the other pre-prepared or pre-submitted questions. There were a whole bunch of questions which we can sort of bundle together, and we should cover off first, because a lot of questions were about the future of the business analysis profession. And of course they would be very sensible questions to ask. So can you talk about perhaps the levels, the branches and roles that business analysis covers? Will there be additional needs? Do you anticipate there'll be additional skills we'll need in order for us to help our organizations anticipate these future worlds that might exist?
Well, I have a couple of different ways for us to look at that. First of all, if you're looking to me for answers, I have some ideas of what might happen. And in fact, that's the topic of my spotlight session at the BBC conference this October, where I'll be talking more about those. But for today, life is going to change. Life as we know it is going to change. And I think what we have to get used to is that there's going to not be a new normal. Those words are flawed. There's going to be what McKinsey calls a next normal, and a next normal, and a next normal, and a next normal. And what you need to look at as a BA is a lot of the questions that were asked to me was, how much data visualization should I know right now? How much data analytics should I need to know right now? What about system architecture if I'm not a developer? I mean, all these very specific questions about today. Mm-hmm. And so I want to shift that conversation. What I would suggest you do, and I did this last night, I just went on and I Googled this, and I've done this for my clients. It's very simple. Google jobs in 2030. Google jobs in 2040. Just Google them. And I'm telling you, you're going to get articles from people who study this far more deeply than I do. And take a look at what they're proposing, because 60 to 80% of the jobs in the future will be different than they are today. And I think that this is where people who go to college, so I teach at a university as well, have a real dilemma. So let's say someone who's an undergraduate or someone who wants to get a degree, let's say in data science. I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to get a degree in data science. The real question is, when I'm finished in 2 years or 4 years, will that still be wanted? And so you cannot make these decisions standing in today, projecting to tomorrow. That's called forecasting. Forecasting will always be short. What you have to do is step into the future, and you can do this as an individual. My students do it. So they'll look out 10 years, 15 years from now and say, what sorts of career choices might there be available that people are talking about? Where do my passions and my interests align? What do I perceive to be my legacy or my destiny? Because that's the sort of work I do. I'm not even into passion. I'm more into, I've been called to do certain sorts of work. But with that in mind, then, what will it take for me to do some of those roles, not a single role, but do some of those roles going into the future so I can better prepare? And if I can give you an example, would that be okay?
Yeah.
So an example is a field that I've stumbled upon. It's a little over a year ago now, and I had Laurie and Pratt who created this term on my recent LinkedIn Live show. And the term is decision intelligence. And it's the combination of the fields of data science, management science, and social science. Cassie Koskroff at Google switched her job title actually to align with decision intelligence. So she's no longer the chief data scientist, she's the chief decision scientist. There is no university in the world that has anything on decision intelligence. Not right now. I believe that's the future. I have been speaking this for the last 5 years. I didn't have a word to say, oh, hey, my method for collaborative data-informed decision-making is a form of decision intelligence work. And Laurie has other methods that she outlines in her book called Link. And she and I have been talking, we talk almost weekly now, about how do we bring this field forward and how do we bring it into academia. But that's what I want other people to do too, is stand in the future, take a look at what's going to be coming forward, and then say, how do I embrace some of those roles, or what would it take for me to do those things? Now, I personally believe, so this is an aside, I personally believe that BAs, their future role, or one of them, is in decision intelligence, because there is no one today in organizations, and you've heard me say this, who is actually facilitating the decisioning process. Everyone wants to do a piece of it. I want to learn analytics. I want to learn visualization. I want to learn how to do business storytelling. I want to learn, well, but who's facilitating the whole? And right now, the information that's coming out to chief data officers, chief analytics officers, CTOs, CIOs is telling them it's not their role to facilitate decisioning. Well, whose role is it? Whose role is it? I mean, and I would say to BAs, step in and fill the gap. So
yeah,
that's just...
And I mean, I know this is something we've spoken about before. I heard you speak about it in Cape Town, and it really resonated, because even if we take that to like a very concrete level, where, you know, decision makers ask for reports, and there are people that create reports. So there are people who will run a query or do whatever. And you know, I know we've talked about this sort of pattern before, but it's like someone will say, "Can you get me this report?" Someone will build them that report, and then they'll say, "And can you get me more data?" And then this thing will happen. But actually, nobody's asked, "Well, what are you trying to decide?" Because actually, you know, a report is a solution. What's the problem? What are we trying to predict or anticipate here? And BAs have that sort of that inquisitive mind to ask those things.
And that's a perfect example of, on an individual level, applying exactly what we're talking about today. How can we anticipate the future? If I don't understand the way you're going to use something, and I'll tell you something, most business leaders haven't thought that far. And that's okay, because that's why we exist, right? We exist to help them to think through what it is that they're planning to do with what we give them. But I think we have to even take that a step farther, because it's like, why are we even doing reports? Why are we even you know, doing monitoring? I'm sorry, where my head is at is, who's going to shift? And I had a conversation with a woman about this yesterday, about how she's going to do this in her organization. How are we going to shift the fundamental precept upon which organizations are based on, away from dashboards and metrics, to what are the key decisions we need to make, and then how do we support making those decisions? And then let's talk about Agile. How do we nimbly change that on a routine basis? And the woman I talked to yesterday has been doing that within programs and projects. She runs a PMO, and she comes at it solely from decisions. She's like, don't give me a charter up front. What are the key decisions we need to make in the next 3 months? Then let's see what we need to do. What's the project plan to go around those? Where do we need to be agile or waterfall? And then we can go forward.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And the dashboard analogies I always find interesting, because you think about a dashboard in a car, right? A dashboard will tell you how fast you're going or whatever. And you can have a roadmap, and, you know, we have strategic roadmaps. But you think about an analogy. Well, if I was driving by car, I could take a roadmap. I could work out exactly where I need to turn the wheel. I could work out exactly where I am theoretically by looking at the speedometer, and if I didn't look out the windshield, I'd crash. But so some of this then presumably is actually about looking out, metaphorically looking out the windshield at the stuff that's in front of us, as well as the stuff that's already happened or is happening. It's about that anticipation, so we can nimbly pivot or change.
Right, but I'm gonna tweak that just a little bit.
Okay, yeah.
Anytime we use historical data, this is what COVID taught us, which I actually, some of you may wonder, like, why I'm happy about this, because I'm really happy, is COVID taught us that all historical data is suspect. End of story. It's suspect. And yet we've put all our time and money into historical data. What we're missing, and I am preaching right now, probably to the choir, but I'll tell you, data scientists are trying to pick up on what I'm saying, is we need foresight data. Foresight data is not an extrapolation of yesterday, today, or tomorrow going forward. It is about this out here, the future. I stand someplace in the future. I say, where is this place in the future I want to get to? And then I can use a technique called backcasting to back and say, what are all the steps I need to take to get there? So if I take your car analogy, you know, it's, and I'm thinking about this right now. I moved to Las Vegas 3 years ago. I absolutely adore it here, but Las Vegas today is not the Las Vegas I moved to 3 years ago. And so what does that mean? Like, where do I want to go next? And I can't extrapolate from historical going forward. I actually have to say to myself, what do I envision my life? So I'll be 62 this summer. What do I envision my life to be like when I'm 70 years old, 8 years from now? Well, what sort of life would I like? Now, if the pandemic were to continue, which we know, I mean, those of us who are doing strategy work knew pandemics were coming in the early 2000s. This is not a wild card to us. The issue is just timing. But we knew they were coming, and we knew there were going to be a sequence. And if you think that this is the last one, I'm sorry to tell you, it's not. But what sort of life experience do I want to have at age 70? And then once I know that, then I can start to say, where do I want to direct the car? Does that make any sense?
It does. I mean, again, it's kind of like that backcasting of having that longer term view, working backwards, pointing the car at it, but learning as you go along. Because if a highway's closed, you take the back roads or whatever. So it's collecting, it's having that view and collecting as we go along, which actually leads us. We've had our first live question. And the first live question is, in the scenario of give the decisions that you need to make in the next 3 months, how do you capture the data fast enough?
Well, therein lies the, I'm going to switch thinking. It's not about capturing the data fast enough. It's about going through a decisioning process and saying, if this is the decision I need to make, what's the data that will support it? We may not have that data available. But guess what? We never have. I think that's the other myth. We think we have all this data. We think, data marketplaces. If we collect all the historical data we've had in the past, we'll be able to use it in the future. Wrong. We just proved ourselves wrong with COVID. So there's always going to be a risk, a level of risk that you have to assume, or a leader has to assume in a decision-making process. So your job is to help them say, what data exists? What data do we not have, and what risks are we willing to take? Or where could we find alternate data sources that might give us a hint about what it is we're trying to learn? And that's where really other people who are doing statistical analyses, data analysis, not data analysis, because they typically don't even know statistics, data science may be able to help us to really think about what are these other sources. But every decision that's being made today is being made with a lot of risk, even if you have data. But people just aren't willing to acknowledge that that's happening. And I think that's, if we facilitate the decision-making process, we'll get closer to understanding what it is, what risk we're willing to assume going forward. And we'll start talking about multiple possibilities versus the one right answer. Because guess what? There isn't a right answer.
Yeah. So it's actually then becoming more comfortable with ambiguity.
Yes.
But which is actually a more honest position to be in, because let's face it, I mean, it comes back to, like, every plan that's ever written is like, it's not the territory. Every map is wrong, right? So actually sort of appreciating that transparency. So we've got a comment in from, actually a friend and colleague of mine, Hertje, from the Netherlands. Glad you could be with us, Hertje. And she says, hi, Adrian and Laurie. Not a question, but an observation. The Dutch government is developing a dashboard to use for their COVID policy. The analogy they use is that they are looking in the back viewing mirror instead of the future. This aligns completely with your analogy. It's completely clear if you explain it like that, but it's difficult to get the decision makers from looking at the data to the decisions. So an interesting analogy there.
Well, what I want to add to that, though, is that if you understand the use of statistical process control, which a lot of people are not talking about. I'm going to do a live show on this in July, because I'm so angry that this piece is missing. If you're going to look at historical data, look at it on a run chart or look at it on a control chart.
Yes, yes, yes.
Data over time. And a lot of time that's not the way it's visualized. It's visualized in bar charts. If you start to look at it as data over time, that's one source. So the Dutch government, if they're exclusively looking at that source, that could become problematic. On the other hand, if they're looking very short term and looking to make short term decisions, and I see these variations, they have to figure out is what variation's normal and just part of the system, and what variation suggests that there is an instability going on, and it's not normal. But unless you know how to create control charts and control limits and know how to interpret in that way, you're not going to know that. So it isn't like we can't do that, but that's for short-term decisioning. And the show today is about anticipating the future.
Yeah,
so the bigger piece is predictability. And I can't predict always from forecast. I can predict from what the future is going to tell me. So, I'm going to go back to my earlier comment about we knew the pandemic was coming.
Yeah.
Those people who knew the pandemic were coming, which are a lot of public health folks or people who are veterinary pathologists who work inside of pharmaceutical companies, they knew it was coming. Now, did they prepare their own families? I knew it. I didn't prepare. I didn't, but what I did say to myself a long time ago was I need to have multiple sources of income just in case. So in a way, it's multiple scenarios. And I see we have lots of questions coming in.
Yeah. So our next question, again from Hercher, is what would you advise as the first steps for people that are trying to change the opinion of stakeholders from dashboards to decisions? Really good question.
First of all, you need to change the conversation yourself. So you need to step in. And so it's kind of like, was it Copernicus? Like, help me out here. I don't know my astronomy really well.
Me neither.
I'm hoping you're smarter than I am. Do you remember there was a time in history when everybody thought that the solar system revolved around the Earth, right?
No.
And then we said, no, there's the sun and the planets revolve around the sun. That's the level of mindset and paradigm shift we're talking about here. Because right now, every tech company on the face of this earth that produces an application is data focused. They're not decision focused. And the reason they're not decision focused, and I've talked to a lot of leaders in these companies, is because they can't codify the decisioning process, which is all about human reasoning, within an application. Can't do it. You need the human. We have to bring the human back in. So the first thing that you need to do is start shifting the conversation yourself with people and doing exactly, Adrian, what you said. You want this data? Well, help me to understand what sorts of decisions you're trying to make with it. Or tell me about a situation that you anticipate is going to come up in the future that you would like to have the answer to if you had a magic 8-ball or a crystal ball or something, right? That will help to shift the conversation. It's the only place to start. Now you can, I have videos and other things on my YouTube channel that talk about what the decisioning process looks like. Get yourself educated about that and start thinking about the group of people you need to bring together to make those decisions in a collaborative manner. That's the gift that BAs have, isn't it? I just really think it is. And I don't know of any other, well, maybe other than maybe some quality professionals inside of organizations, maybe a few finance people, but BAs have the best interests of the business in mind as a whole, and knowing the business of the business. So you've got to know that up front, which is also an issue in terms of anticipating the future. You got to know the business of the business.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said there, Laurie, about bringing the human back in, because I know one of the themes that came up in the pre-submitted questions that you elicited was around AI and how actually AI might radically change the way BAs do work, because some of the more routine administrative type stuff could be done by some sort of AI bot or whatever. But actually, from what you're saying there, I think where we can really add value is in those human interactions, even if the routine stuff is AI'd away from us or AI'd with us. Well, actually, if we understand that one of the things we do is bring people together to have those really difficult but crucial conversations, then actually that's what's going to be valuable in a world of automation.
Yes, and I want to say something else. There is a fundamental assumption being made in the statement about AI. You have to decide if you want to make AI a fundamental truth in the future? Like, will it exist, yes or no? Or is it a variable about the future?
Mm.
And those are going to get you down two completely different paths. So when I do, like, last year, I ran a number of one-day workshops that BAs could come to actually learn the process of doing scenario planning and actually do scenarios, meaning that it was like there's two paths happening at once. And it was not unusual in the scenario work that one of the two uncertainties was around what will technology look like in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a different world than someone who assumes AI will be there. Now, tech companies are going to tell you AI is going to be there. It's in their best interest to selling their products. So you have to really be careful about the hype that you hear from tech companies versus going to someone like a Daniel Burrus, who is a tech futurist, and listening to what he's saying about the future, because he's studying this stuff 24/7, or finding other tech futurists, because they don't all agree. But just trying to get a grasp of, you know, if I pick the year 2030 and I put in, again, into a search engine, you know, what types of technologies are people predicting will exist in a ubiquitous manner in 2030, you might get some different answers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Stefan, who I think made the point about AIs, added a clarification in the chat saying that he very much saw it as taking over stuff like solution requirements, not the stuff we're talking about here. So I think we're all very much on the same page with that, which is great. And I'm glad you could tune in, Stefan. So good. Okay, so let's take another live question. So Jason asks, hi Adrian and Laurie, we had a great internal BA practice talk today about the Cynefin framework, which is Dave Snowden and Competent Edge's framework, as in case anyone on the line hasn't heard of it, in which we did a topical initiative interactive exercise. Although it's subjective, the simple model can be widely used to unpack current and predicted business problems. And Jason also says he's really enjoying the session so far. Excellent. That's good to know, Jason. So what are your thoughts on the Cynefin framework, Laurie?
Well, there are a variety of different frameworks out there that you can use to think about strategic thinking. But can I draw a picture before we go further about something?
Yeah.
So what I'd like you to do, if you're listening right now, because I want to make a clarification before we go much further about what it is that we're really talking about. So what I'd like you to do, and I've kind of have a whiteboard here, so I'm going to do it at the same time, is I want you to draw like a really big, like a circle or some sort of design. So I've just done it like this on my page. And then what I want you to do is in the center of it, I want you to put like another object, and I want you to put ST, standing for strategic thinking. And then what I want you to do is I want you to start drawing arrows, and you can put two-way arrows like I am coming out of this. You can do a number of them. But I think there's something we need to talk about first. And I'm just going to draw a bunch of these. I'm going to draw like 5 of them. Off of one of the arrows, I'm going to put an SF for strategy formulation. Okay. And then off of another one, I'm going to put SP for strategic planning. And off of another one, I'm going to put SE, which is where the BA community is in terms of its documents with IIBA, for SE called strategy execution. Okay, and then off of another one, I might put the word, and I'm going to put this with a question mark, is I'm going to put V for visioning, because sometimes visioning is a part of strategic thinking, sometimes it's not. And then I'm just going to have another circle here that has a question mark in it. Now, inside of each of these elements that I've drawn here, I want you to put the letter D, and obviously I'm thinking about the English language here versus another language right now. And I don't want you to put a D, though, in strategic thinking.
Okay.
I want you to leave that without a D. And you're going to come up with something that starts to look like this. Now, strategic thinking has nothing to do with decisioning at all. It is truly about having these conversations that explode a topic, having a dialogue, and I use that word purposely, it's not a discussion. It's not a debate. A lot of times when people talk about strategic thinking, they're like, oh, we're going to debate something. Oh, no. We're not debating anything. What we're going to do is we're going to be reflective in a conversation, dialogue-like, that's just like, huh. You know, if we look at the year 2030 and what might happen in the field of technology, what are the sorts of things that other people are talking about? Not our views, because our views are always myopic. But what are they talking about? You know, what sorts of things can we glean? Are we seeing some similar words over again? Maybe we'll say, well, that could be a trend, right? You know, we're just like pulling out things. But the Cynefin framework and others help us to recognize that we don't see everything, that we are blind to some things, right? And then there are these unknowns, and these conversations are meant to bubble to the surface the sorts of things that we haven't thought about before, that are unconscious to us, that may be blind spots, and so on. And so there are multiple tools you can use to do that. What you have to be careful about, because this is what happens all the time, is that as soon as you move to decisioning, you're in one of these other buckets. And we do that very quickly. Well, maybe we should do this. No, we're not talking about maybe we should do this. We're not. We're just talking about, let's have this broad, open chat about what if, what could be, what's being proposed, exploratory. So I don't know if that makes any sense to add to this piece or this comment, but to me, I don't think we can stand away from that.
I think it does, and what I'm hearing, Laurie, if I understand correctly, is almost a divergent type of thinking.
Yes.
It's about exploring the possibilities, and I do think it's interesting, because going back to the Cynefin framework, and again, I don't know, Jason, if you find this, but I find one of the real challenges on the ground as a BA is it almost feels to me like every stakeholder assumes, and it depends which version of the Cynefin framework you were looking at, but everyone sort of assumes they're in the simple domain.
Yes.
But actually, often things are complicated or complex, and
correct.
And actually, there may or may not be the types of causation that stakeholders think there are. So I spend a lot of my time as a BA convincing people not to do the very thing that I've been brought in to do, but to actually think. And ironically, what you were saying there, Laurie, really resonated with me, but perhaps not at a whole organizational level, but sometimes at an initiative level, is actually go back and think, well, hang on a minute, what external things are affecting what we're doing here? Because if we don't deliver something that's coherent with those external things, then we may as well not bother. And an analogy I often use is, it's like the Titanic, right? You know, if we don't know the iceberg's there, then you know, what's the point of rearranging the deck chairs? To quote a kind of cliche.
Right. So. Well, I think though, to go back to what you're saying, so I'm going to add to what you're saying with this diagram.
Okay.
So, and I'm going to add it. I'm just going to take the common acronym of VUCA, and I'm just going to put it in here.
Yeah.
Because the dilemma we have in organizations, and this has to do with how the human brain is structured. The human brain, system one, has a real desire to make everything simple and very easy, when in fact we live in a complex, complicated world. And I understand that we can try to box things and say, well, but some of these things are different. But the reality is, when you start to look outside of an organization, which is what you're talking about, right? How do we bring the external, internal into our conversations? We start to see that life is not what we thought it was. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't simplicity and elegance in complexity, right? Because we can still see patterns, we can still see trends, we can still see these other things that emerge. They don't emerge from the perking. I mean, it's like a series of perking signals have to get together to kind of say, oh my gosh, right? That's the tradition of the butterfly, analogy that people use, right? When they talk about complexity theory. So to me, I don't care which models you use, as long as you start to get at the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, and it's kind of interesting because one of the things that and I don't know, I know these aren't my words, so I've borrowed them from someone, but I find myself using the term cultivate a conversation a lot. That actually, if a
Oh,
model
beautiful.
cultivates a conversation, then it's probably done what it's needed to do. And I think,
Correct.
Cynefin definitely does that. The Stacey matrix, or the Stacey diagram, for people who are familiar with like the work of Ralph Stacey, although bizarrely he edited it out from like the second version of his book onwards, which there must be a story behind that. But so Jason's just added he wholeheartedly agrees. So I think we're all on the same page, which is great. So our next live question is from Nefra. So really glad you could make it, Nefra. She's a regular on our webinars, which is always nice. And Nefra says, so strategic thinking is almost the opposite of strategy, in that strategy is a static thing that has been formulated based on past knowledge, forecast to a future idea based on the past, whereas strategic thinking is an open space that has no right or wrong, just endless dedication to not landing on a solution. What would you say to that?
Nefra's talking about how strategy is practiced.
Right, yes.
Not how strategy is intended.
Yes.
So I just had this conversation. I did a webinar for my university a few weeks ago on this, and I had another professor say to me, so with what you're telling me about strategic thinking, we have to shift the way strategy is done, not the way we teach it. And my answer was absolutely. So strategy was never intended to be static. But again, the human brain likes easy. The human brain likes simplicity. And we don't know the tools and methods. And if we do know them, we don't use them to actually this is why I drew the arrows both directions on here. Mm-hmm. It's a back and forth conversation. I do some strategic thinking that may allow us to say, what are our 3 breakthroughs going to be in this particular arena? But we still continue to do strategic thinking to say what else is shifting. Is there a wild card that's entering that we didn't anticipate? Or are some other, if we looked at multiple scenarios, which elements of those are starting to come together in different ways. But if we use the tools of scanning the environment regularly, understanding perking signals, continuing to have these, I love that phrase, by the way, cultivate the conversation. That's a beautiful phrase. You ought to trademark that. Seriously. You need to. Someone else is going to steal it. And do this back and forth, then we won't have the static nature of it. Now, that doesn't mean that a strategy has to change. I'm just suggesting that there needs to be an ongoing conversation and not, oops, that's done. Oops, that's done. We now know what we want to do. And we see this a lot on programs and initiatives. I don't care if you're talking waterfall or agile, you still see it where people get locked and loaded into a solution and they don't ever revisit it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, that definitely resonates at a program or project level, and I think it's almost like some people see strategy as a noun. It's like it's a thing, it's a document, and we lose sight of the fact that no, it's a stated intent at a point in time.
Yes,
and actually, that needs to be seen as a stated intent at a point of time, and time changes. It's out of date by the time it may be out of date by the time it's hit the printer, type of thing. So okay, so you mentioned, yeah, please.
Can I comment on that just a bit? It won't be out of date if you do foresight work. If you forecast into your strategies, they will be out of date. But I have clients who are standing in the year 2030, 2040, looking at what is the future going to hold, all these different sorts of possibilities, and creating, and this is even at the program and project level, folks, to say, what's the implication of these things? Now I'm moving to decisioning back to what we're wanting to do, because it's going to take us 3 years to do this. So we have to somehow meet in the middle. And if I know what this future is going to hold out here, and I can backcast while we're looking this direction, then it won't be outdated. It won't be outdated, but it's when we only use forecasting to do strategy work that we see flaws. Now, there are some academics who would disagree with me because their whole life is built upon forecasting, but those of us in doing foresight work and strategic thinking, we have examples. We have examples of where you can step into the future. And you know what? I guess the added piece I'd say to this is what COVID did is it accelerated that future, slapping us right against the face.
Yeah, it was a big wake-up signal for many.
Yes.
But so we've got one other question or comment that is sometimes it's hard when people treat strategy as almost like a god, and everything that flows down from it is the apex of the pyramid. So this presumably, I'm guessing, also relates to a sort of a very hierarchical command and control type culture. So, I mean, any thoughts on that, Laurie?
Well, I think it's the iteration. So I'm going to bring in something that I learned many years ago when I was working in the field of total quality. It's the difference between the standardized do check act cycle and the plan do check act cycle. And these two cycles are interwoven. Mm-hmm. And at a point in time, you do have to lock in, but that doesn't mean this other cycle is still not happening.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to have, it's the ability, Michael Tushman talks about this in another way. He says, it's what we call structural ambidexterity, the ability to exploit the current at the same time that we're exploring the future. And so you have to lock, because you have to still get things done in organizations, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, how do you have the flow between these two pieces? And how do you continue to have these conversations while we're still deploying? And this goes back to decisioning. When does leadership know, and this can be even on a program or project level or a product level, when to pull the plug?
Yeah.
It's like it's not going well, we need to pull the plug. That, to me, is a sign of both of these working together. It's when it's this hierarchy and it's deployed and we never pull the plug, but we know it's not working.
Yeah, so sort of synchronizing those gears in a way, so that they talk together. And what I was thinking when you were saying that, Laurie, is also, as BAs, we design processes a lot, and one of the things that I always think is crazy is sometimes there can be, if we talk about perking signals or whatever, well, often there's feedback that should come in from the front line, but the front line has absolutely no mechanism of feeding that back in any way that's ever going to be realistically heard. And one of the conversations I've had before is, sort of anonymizing this so it's not client specific, but it's sort of like, well, if we're looking to improve something, have we looked at all of the complaint logs, for example? Because there's probably some insight into things, people are probably telling us a whole bunch of stuff that we're not even looking at a systematic level here.
Well, see, what I would like, if I were putting on my strategic thinking lens and I was looking at a complaint log, I'd be looking for the outlier comments.
Yeah. But you see, there are those outliers sometimes where you can see what they're actually giving you is the gift of they've really thought it through. They've had a bad experience, and they're saying, look, what you need to do is like, or they'll say stuff like, you're in a different league to this company. Like, this company over here is so much better than you. You're in a different league, and it's really important to know that, because that's like, okay, we think 5 working days is good. They're doing it in 24 hours.
Correct.
That kind of thing. So moving on to techniques, Laurie, because you mentioned you sort of talked a little bit about environmental scanning. What kind of techniques could we perhaps use as individual practitioners to play with all of this kind of stuff?
Well, I would take the questions that you have in your mind that many of you asked me up front, and say, put them in the year 2030. So what's the state of AI going to be? What is going to be required of organizations in the year 2030? And the first step that you have to do is start reflecting and start collecting information about the future. Not what people are saying inside your organization, but what others who study these areas or these topics or these questions on an ongoing basis say. It's kind of like doing an environmental scan on an individual level. What am I really interested in? But I'm not going to extrapolate from today or look at books from today that are written unless they're by futurists. I'm going to look more at what are others saying about that future. You could, Greg Githens talks about, he keeps what he calls a lab notebook where anytime he gets kind of an insight or an aha about what he's reading, he will note it down. So and he does it in writing, because there's something about the kinesthetic act of writing or drawing pictures and having the ability to go back and look at them that makes a difference in terms of how the human brain works. But you have to do this work, you have to really step up to the table and say, I don't need permission to do strategic thinking work for me or my organization. And I think, to me, those are the really key things. The other stuff you can do inside of conversations with other people is well, first of all, you can send them the articles that you're finding. I do it all the time. If I find interesting articles, I have boxes in my house of articles about the year 2040. And I did it. I laugh when I say this, because my client, we had a ongoing repository online where we were adding in documents about the future. So because you can do on an organizational level, what I'm telling you to do on an individual level is jot down a series of questions and then go find articles to help to answer those questions about the future. Yeah. And someone deleted the site.
Oh no! Oh, no.
I have all the paper copies. It was the only way we were able to restore the site, because the backup was gone too. But do this for yourself. Start collecting these articles, giving them to other people, start sparking the conversation that Adrian's talking about, and then start switching the way you converse in conversations. Reframe them. So someone had said to me, should we, how do we change the conversation around what is done and how it's done on a project? And I did this offline, but I'll do it here. I'm just going to write down some words. There's a trilogy I learned about many years ago, which is the why, the what, the how.
Absolutely. BAs will recognize that.
Right. But how does this translate going down? If this is the top level in the organization, their what is someone else's why.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? And this trilogy goes down, and no one's asking, why are we even doing this? Like, help me to understand where this fits into the bigger scheme of life. And you don't have to ask it as a why question, but just start to create this trilogy and draw it out. Just like I started to do with the answers, and you're going to find multiple gaps in that. The second thing you can do is switch the questions. So if someone says, well, what's happened, or why did, what made that happen, which is an analysis question. That's what you have to listen for. Almost all the questions we ask are analysis questions. How do I change that into a strategic thinking question? Well, let's step forward 5 years. Has anybody thought about what the possible variables could be, or the possible impacts could be 5 years from now, looking back at today? And switch the nature of those conversations. What are the long-term consequences? What are the unintended consequences of what we're doing? All of those are questions in the moment to just bring people to that next step and the step after next. And what I'm most interested in is the step after next. Yeah. And even saying that to people, so what? You're going to do that as the next step. What's the step after next? Will change the conversation.
It's really interesting what you were talking about, the why, what, how, and the sort of fractal or recursive nature of that, because that really resonates with me, because I was thinking about, for many very boring reasons, I was recently thinking about like a phlebotomy service in a hospital. So somewhere you go to have a routine blood test. Right, why does that exist? Well, that exists to take blood and send it to a lab and do that effectively and efficiently, right? But then you ask, well, okay, but why? Well, that exists in a sort of broader system to diagnose a patient's illness, right? But why does that exist? Well, it probably exists in a broader system to treat a patient. Well, why does that exist? It's to keep people, and you can get caught up in situations where you're tinkering around, you're moving the little pieces of this tiny. I mean, it's not unimportant, it's not trivial, but if you don't know that the reason you're taking blood out of someone's arm is to keep people healthy, and I know that sounds like, I know people, medical practitioners and clinicians will of course know that, but you can lose sight. You can make administrative changes at a really small level which don't actually follow the kind of bigger strategic piece.
Well, what you're talking about is how do we take the 5 whys and instead of using them for analysis, use them for synthesis.
Right, right.
Right? And use them for divergent thinking. It's shifting the nature of the conversation to make it go bigger, not go smaller. And so these techniques can be repurposed, but you have to have made the shift in your mind first so you can facilitate the conversation staying at that level. Because you're not talking about root cause here, which is how 5 whys is used. What you're talking about is what's the bigger context, the social implications, the social importance of the work we're doing that helps people to say, I have a social responsibility to do this.
Yeah. So thinking about techniques we can use with others, Laurie, what kind of other techniques that we can use in groups or that we could use in our workshops would you recommend?
I think, well, first of all, for me, it's challenging assumptions. And I gave one early on in this when people were asking me about data and decisioning. I'm challenging a huge, profound assumption right now that the world revolves around data. And I'm saying, no, the world revolves around decisioning. And to continue and to challenge those, but to do them in ways that don't cause people to feel defensive, but cause them to open the door to a conversation. So it's really understanding. In strategic thinking, we talk about the frame. What's the frame that someone's using to make the statement that they're using, and how do you enlarge the frame? Now, there's a picture you can draw, because people always say this to me, and people say to me, "Oh, you're talking about thinking outside the box, right?" So box and a dot, and I'm like, no, I'm not talking about thinking outside the box. I'm talking about enlarging the box.
Right.
To include it. And so there's a tremendous amount of reframing we have to do with people. And your example of the phlebotomy is one of many. But that means you're challenging assumptions and you're causing people to broaden the frame, but you have to understand their frame first. And then, as I said earlier, how do you reframe the questions that are asked within that to make them more about strategic thinking?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of a BA's role in strategic thinking, Laurie, I mean, where would you say BA's, we've sort of touched upon this, but what would you say a BA's role is on strategic thinking, and why should we be interested in it as BAs?
Well, there's 2 different ways to look at that. One is from an individual perspective, and one is from an organizational perspective. Individually, you need to be interested because you have to be able to plot the course of your future. And within the organization, the sorts of things that we're talking about today are huge, huge gaps. If you look at the literature, like when I teach a graduate course on strategic thinking, all the articles are around leaders thinking strategically. Nobody talks about how people at the front line of organizations or in any role need to think strategically, and we all do. So start inserting these techniques into the conversations. You will never be asked to do them. You will never be given permission, but they're really critical. The second thing is there are 2 techniques that BAs can do if you've got a community of BAs in your organization. And I would not trust that your strategy group is doing this. I would be doing a traditional environmental scan. I don't care. Pick a year, 2030, 2040. I don't care. Use what's called the Pestle Framework, which is just some categories. P stands for political, E for economic, and so on. You can look this up online. Write questions within each of those categories about a year in the future that if you had a crystal ball, you could find the answer to, and start collecting information. And reading those articles and having conversations about them amongst yourselves. And then you can even start saying, what implication does this start to have, decisioning now, to the different programs, projects, initiatives that we're a part of, right? And then the second thing you can do with that information, which is invaluable, is do scenario work. Pick a general question about the future. The questions I sometimes use in workshops are just, how will people live, eat, work, and play in a particular geographic area in the year 2030, 2040? But we still take all this environmental scan information and apply it to that. And there are process steps too for doing scenario work. But when you do that, and you do it, and there are organizations that do it regularly. They might have a scenario question a quarter. They're not changing the input data. What they're changing is the question and then how they set it up in terms of, I use a 2x2 matrix. What are the 2 variables, uncertainties, and how do we create 4 different worlds, and then what are the stories within those.
Fantastic. I just want to take a couple of live questions just before we look to conclude. So the first question, Laurie, is from Linda. And Linda says, do you see a chance for automation of BA tasks in the future in order to spend more time with the business on data literacy and validating business processes? I found it in identifying use cases, but wondered if there are other areas where you can see this would occur.
Actually, this is a really interesting question. I believe that we have forgotten in organizations the importance of business process. Yes. And the reason we have forgotten it is because when you put different tech applications in place, they come with their own nomenclature and their own way of viewing the world. And we have got to come back to the fundamentals. Businesses run on business processes. They do not run on the tools of technology. Yep. I think you see the difference. So yep. I desperately see that BAs, we have to step into that even more so today, because we're being, everything that IT and technology is doing is almost like shutting the door to that. And that's a huge dilemma that we face. Second, I get clear on what data literacy means. I have introduced something called data literacy 2.0, because data literacy 1.0, which is focused on individuals learning data analytics, does not profoundly shift the organization. And we've got, and this is another role BAs can play, so to me, data literacy 2.0 is what's the enterprise core competence and culture that's needed to support decisioning in a collaborative manner that is enabled by data. And we better start stepping up into that role as BAs. Nobody's claimed it. OD, organization development professionals, don't exist in many organizations today to help us with it. And that, to me, is a future place that BAs need to come. So I think she's identified some really important places for us to start to put our time and attention now and not wait to be invited to the table.
Definitely. And John's just added a comment saying, yes to bringing back business process. Oh, yes. Applause. So I think you've got a virtual round of applause. Just one final live question before we wrap up. So Nicole asks, would it be fair to say a lot of this will depend on emotional intelligence? I think that's a very, very good observation.
Well, the question I have is, whose emotional intelligence? The dilemma we have right now is that systems and structures are being put into place in organizations that are flying in the face of the work that BAs know is the work that needs to be done. Now, is that emotional intelligence? I think that, it could be you stopping to ask people the right sorts of questions to get them to think it through, but more it's, again, people blindly following what the tech community is telling them to do. And therein lies a bigger issue. So I think that we, in terms of emotional intelligence, need to be able to step into difficult conversations. Yeah. Right? We need to be able to raise the things that people tell us that will get our hands slapped for. Right? And we can't fear that something will happen to us. And I'm one of those people who was let go years ago as a result of that. But you know what? I wouldn't be where I am today in my career if that hadn't happened. So I think that, to her point, yes, and there's an and to it. We've got to start understanding the systems and structures that are being put in that are standing in our way. Absolutely, absolutely. So, Laurie, if you have one closing thought or your one guiding piece of advice to BAs who are listening today, what would that be? Don't wait for permission to begin to think strategically in organizations. Start with your own life first. And when you do that, you will begin to see the possibilities of what you can bring to organizations. No one is ever going to invite you to start looking at articles about the future, listening to podcasts, but go find a few people that you just kind of want to follow in this realm. I even do this. I'm a futurist, I'm a strategist, and I still have my favorites that I go and I listen to and I say, what does that mean? What's the implication to my work today? And that will help you to start asking better questions inside of organizations. Fantastic. So
So don't ask for permission, start in our own lives first. And I think it's fair to say people who have tuned in live, these are exactly the sort of people who are likely to do that. These are the people who are seeking this information. So Laurie, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be here today. I can see from the number of questions, the number of registrations that we had, that this is a really hot topic. So I am certain that people will want to stay in touch with you, Laurie. How can people find out more about what you do? How can they connect with you? There are a couple of questions that we weren't able to answer. I'm sorry about that, but could people contact you afterwards to ask you questions?
The best way to do that is through LinkedIn. I have made that kind of like my number one go-to place that I check. Well, 24/7. I'm up in the middle of the night answering messages, right? It's the start of your day and I should be asleep and I'm still answering them. So connect with me there. Send me an invitation. Use it as a way to communicate with me. If we need to take it offline, we can then move to email. Almost all of the videos, podcasts, webinars that I've done are somehow linked to my profile or to a YouTube channel I have for my LinkedIn Live show called Level Up with Laurie. And for those of you who really want to explore this issue of why business processes are being ignored, I have a show this Thursday that we're going to do with Robert Vane out of the UK on this topic. And I'm going to tell you, it's going to be so sensitive that others in the audience will probably be really angry and you'll be cheering. I'd love to have you all there.
Fantastic. Well, Laurie, what I'll do is there's an email that will go out after this session. So if you're watching live, you'll get an email after this session with a short link to a survey. Would really appreciate it if you could fill that survey in. But I'll also put a link to your LinkedIn profile, Laurie, so people can click right onto it and connect with you there. So thank you very much, Laurie, and a massive thank you as well to everyone who tuned in live. As a reminder, these BA community webinars, they're really designed to discuss topics that are perhaps on the periphery of business analysis, topics that we don't talk about as much as we maybe should. And I guess to use that expression again, it's about cultivating a conversation in our own community. So when you do click on that link with the survey, you'll also see there's one of the main questions is, what topics do you want in future webinars? So if you have a particular topic in mind, let me know. I'll try and find a way of getting someone to present on it. Equally, if you're sitting there thinking, I would love to present on something, then let me know, because we can absolutely definitely make that happen. So thanks again, Laurie, for a really insightful. So much in my head is buzzing around now, as it always does when we speak. So enjoy the rest of your day and hope to see you very soon.
I hope to see you again soon too. And thank you to everyone who attended today.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.